Well, I'm going to let Carl finish up there. Sorry about that.
No problem, yeah.
So good afternoon, folks. Good afternoon, Victoria. I want to talk about jQuery. Um, so jQuery is an immensely popular JavaScript library. And to put that in context, that's like saying oxygen is an immensely popular gas. jQuery is probably singularly responsible for driving a lot of the advancements in web development that we've had over the past decade. And that's a bold statement to make. A couple things about jQuery that I'm going to emphasize here at the beginning and then throughout the rest of the lecture. jQuery is just JavaScript. There's some things about it that seem a little bit magic, but at the end of the day, jQuery is just JavaScript. It is written in 100% pure vanilla JavaScript, no magic, no fairy dust, nothing like that. You can actually go and look at the source code for jQuery. In fact, I kind of advocate for going and looking at the source code of jQuery because it's extremely well written and will teach you a lot about client-side JS. So a little bit of history. Yes?
Victoria can't see you.
Oh, they can't see me. Oh, look at that. The camera is frozen. Let's fix that. That one. And then battery's already off. There we go. That should be better. You made me realize I didn't have the right window up on Slack either. There we go. Cool. So, a little bit of history. The very first blog post proposing the idea of a library like jQuery came out August 22nd, 2005. So jQuery, the idea of it's been around for a while. It was actually launched at Bar Camp, New York City, a dev conference, January 14th, 2006. So jQuery has just had its 13th birthday. It's old enough to join the Boy Scouts. Pardon me, Scouts. So it's been around for a while. And there are plenty of places you can go online where you will read blog posts about how you don't need jQuery. In fact, there's a domain, youdon'tneedjQuery.com. There are plenty of people who will tell you that jQuery is antiquated, that it's irrelevant, that it's old school, that it's buggy, that it's slow, that it's a whole bunch of mean, nasty, ugly things. And then I find myself pulling up this bit here from the history section of Wikipedia, and I'm not citing Wikipedia as a scientifically accurate source, but it's not the worst. And so it says that it was originally created in January 2006, but the really important point starts here in the third paragraph, where we talk about, in 2015, jQuery was used on 63% of the top 1 million websites and 17% of all internet websites. Okay, cool. 2015 stat, not that long ago, but JavaScript's always evolving, new stuff's always coming out. All the cool kids are using React nowadays. So, why would jQuery be relevant? Then we read the next sentence. As of June 2018, jQuery is used on 73% of the top 1 million websites and by 22.4% of all websites. Now, I don't know about you, but my understanding is that the internet's growing a lot, and in 3 years has grown a lot. And if there's something out there that is still on 22.4% of all websites, it's relevant. And it's relevant because of how powerful it is. So I wanted to set that context to begin with, because as a new developer, especially as you are building ideas and opinions regarding the technologies that you probably want to be involved with, one of the things that, is likely to inform your opinions is the amount of, I don't want to say hate, but distaste for jQuery that you will get when you read the newest, most hemorrhaging edge JavaScript blog written by somebody with, pairs of months of experience in the field. And the truth is, it's incredibly relevant. It's incredibly powerful. And the fact that it has been the #1 JavaScript library pretty much since it came out in 2006 says that it's something worth knowing. So let's talk about what it is and what it isn't. Like I said, it is just JavaScript. So the idea of jQuery came about because since browsers have different engines, each different browser that's out there has a different engine that powers its JavaScript parsing, then there's going to be slight variations, just by necessity almost, in how certain things in JavaScript get interpreted. As much as we might like to say, that most people in English speak Canada, if you have never been to Newfoundland and you suddenly hear somebody native from there, or Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, or Texas, when you start hearing people from various English-speaking places in the world, quite often you can find things that are nearly not understandable. I was watching a show on Netflix the other day, and I literally had to stop watching because the Irish accent, even though they were speaking English, was so thick, I had to go and turn on the subtitles to figure out what they were saying, and I generally consider myself good with accents. So what jQuery did, and still does, is it standardizes the approach to a lot of common DOM actions that you might want to do, and under the hood of jQuery takes care of making sure that it's going to work the same on all browsers. So you now have a write once, use everywhere kind of library, which is a really powerful thing. Less so in our more modern era than 13 years ago, but when you wanted to, let's say, animate a box, like the boxes I had in the example this morning, let's say you wanted to animate, click a button and have one of those slide across the screen. You would actually have to write the function to do that in 3 different flavors 13 years ago. You'd write it once for Chrome, once for Firefox, and then you'd spend twice as much time writing it once for Internet Explorer. Because each one of those browsers did that particular thing very, very differently. The way that you would have to search for that element, the way that you would address the style properties on that element were very different on each one of those browsers. And so the guy that created it, John Resig, who is just utterly brilliant, now he works for Khan Academy. He's like the senior front-end guy for Khan Academy. He got really fed up with having to write the same code 3 times. In some cases 4 if it was going to show on a mobile browser. Not that there was as much mobile browsing going on then as there is now. Sorry, Gabe, I don't know which nearly that meant.
When you were talking about the English language.
Oh.
So I think it's past.
Okay.
Past time.
Hell, I even forgot what I said. As happens in the development world, because John got tired of writing the same type of code over and over and over again in different versions for different browsers, he wrote himself a library that standardized these behaviors so that he could use this library in each one of the projects that he was working on and save himself grief. Really, that was how jQuery came to be, is John Resig, as a JavaScript developer, got really frustrated at something he had to do, so he automated it. And he thought it was really cool, and he had people telling him, hey, that's a really cool thing you've done. So he presented the idea at Barcamp. And if we look at this history, within 10 days, a blog had been set up to track the progress of distributing this library. The very first jQuery plugin was built the next day. And by the 27th, less than 2 weeks after launching it at the conference, they now needed a mailing list to be able to broadcast to people about changes that were happening with this new library. Many things came, and it started being available via version control system called SVN, Subversion, and the alpha release happened on June 30th, 2006. So suddenly it became a big open source movement. It became something that front-end developers everywhere were latching onto. So that's kind of a brief bit of the history and why it came to be. But let's talk a little bit about what it is. So what it is can be summarized as that. And that's valid JavaScript. And the reason that's valid JavaScript is because JavaScript will allow you to set the $sign as the name of a function. That is something that will happen. Under the hood, there is also this function. The $sign is just an alias for jQuery. So if I was to show you this function, you'd be like, okay, cool. Yeah, that's a function called jQuery. I know what that looks like. But when I show you this, suddenly people think that they are speaking a new language. No. Literally, what happened was, in the code, once jQuery is defined, they do that. Semicolon. Like that is a line of code in the jQuery source code. So that the $sign it becomes an alias for the jQuery function. A little bit of funny story. At the time this came out, so 2006, and also leading into 2007, there were a couple of different libraries that were coming out at that time inspired by the work that had been done by jQuery and another library called CSS Query that were doing similar things. So there was jQuery, there was one called Scriptaculous, there was another one called Dojo, and those three were, there's also one called MooTools. So those four really were big enough that they were competing with each other. And one of the biggest things they were competing for was who got to use the $sign. Whose library was going to be recognized as being the $sign, because for some reason that was considered to be an elegant function to run. It was easy to type, easy to understand and look at and see what it was. And so these libraries were competing. At the end of the day, jQuery won. And that's why we don't hear about Scriptaculous, MooTools, or Dojo pretty much anymore. They're still out there, they still exist, but their market share went to next to nothing. And so jQuery kind of won the battle for the $sign, and this has become kind of universally recognized as the jQuery function now. And the interesting thing about the jQuery function is there are it's nice and simple because there's only three things you ever pass to the jQuery function. You can pass a string to the jQuery function. And that's a selector. . So this morning, we looked at document.querySelector, say, something. We looked at that as a way to run a function and select anything that matched that CSS. Well, in jQuery, that's this. So you're already ahead of the game, and one of the reasons which I didn't answer Aiden's question this morning with, I think it was your question, about why I was preferring document.querySelector over the other functions. It's because I knew we were going to get to jQuery, and that way the pattern that we learned this morning carries through. The other reasons were still valid, but one of my other ones was that's the pattern that we use when we use jQuery. So we can pass a string as a selector. Now, also as a selector, we can look up an element with something like document.querySelector, document.getElementById. We can pass that to jQuery, and it will work. The second thing that we can pass to it is another string, but this is an HTML string. And this is how we create new elements. So jQuery allows me to do that. And when I do that, it creates a new paragraph tag for me, which is kind of cool. So any arbitrary string of HTML, I can pass to it, and it will create those nodes for me. It's still up to me to put them into the DOM in the right place, but it creates those nodes for me. Super useful. And when you're using jQuery, this is 100% the ideal way to create your elements and then be able to work with them. The last thing that you can pass to jQuery is a function. And there's a funny thing that happens when you pass the function. That code literally looks like this. And the funny thing that happens is this is exactly the same as the infamous document.ready. So, if you remember this morning, we ran into a situation, which Shmoo fixed for us, where because we had the script tag up at the top of the page, we couldn't get access to anything that we had built in the DOM. The JavaScript was running too early before the browser had actually parsed our HTML. Well, wouldn't it be cool if there was a way that we could tell the JavaScript not to run until the document was ready? Ta-da! We have that now. And so behind the scenes, there is actually, we could actually do this. DOM content loaded and some function. Behind the scenes, we could write vanilla JavaScript that would listen for this event on the document. And when that event fires, anything that is inside this function would then run. So I could have taken all the code I wrote this morning, wrapped it inside this callback function, and it would have worked with the script tag at the top of the page. But that's a lot to type, especially if all I needed to do was move the script tag. Well, jQuery gives us this idea of what's called document ready, which is waiting for this event to happen. And if you're putting on your Captain Crunch decoder ring and looking at line 22 there, DOM content loaded is the name of the event that gets triggered when the browser has finished parsing the DOM. When it's done building the DOM, the browser actually broadcasts an event and says, hey, I'm done with this. The content has been loaded. And that's something that we can listen for. And so jQuery is built around the idea that since its primary purpose is to work with the DOM, we need an easy way to set up that event listener. And so the long form of it, which you will see all over the internet, is this. We take the document object, we put it in jQuery, put it through the jQuery function, and then .ready is a jQuery method that says, when that thing is ready, run this function. But we can simplify that just by doing this. It actually reads easier too. If you pass a function to the jQuery method, it will automatically be registered as a callback for document ready. Yeah.
Do you have to put the content of your code in between the curly braces?
So the question is, do you have to put the content of your code in between the curly braces? Yes, any code that you want to run, especially code that needs to have access to the DOM, goes inside that function. So, that sounds great, but how do we actually use it in practice? So, I have taken the liberty, let me actually fire up the server here. I have taken the liberty of setting up an HTML page. Took me hours to do this. Okay, it took about 6 seconds to write the copy command from one folder to another. The only thing I've changed here is I've added a script tag. So the script tag I've added is on line 6, and this is loading the jQuery library onto my page, so that I can now use jQuery to do what I was doing before. And so I want to comparison contrast the work that we did before with the work that we can now do using the jQuery library. Yeah, Clive.
You're saying that like Chrome has it installed?
No.
Okay, so that was a misunderstanding.
Yeah.
You always have to load it.
Yeah, so I did, the confusion there was he thought I had said that Chrome always has it installed. Chrome has a JavaScript engine, but not the jQuery library. Yeah. You always have to load jQuery in as a dependency. You can download the actual jQuery code and just have it as a JavaScript file in your app that you load in with a script tag, like my script.js there. You can do that, works totally fine. In this case, I'm choosing to load it from the jQuery site, and there's a benefit to doing this. The benefit to doing this is if, I'll pick on Samantha because she's sitting right here. Let's say Samantha loads this page, our extremely high profile, design winning, award winning website here. And it has the jQuery library from this site linked into it. So her browser is still going to have to go out on the internet, fetch that jQuery library, and download a copy of it. But then she turns around and she goes to Leon's blog, because all the cool JavaScript devs are going to Leon's blog. And Leon has also used this exact same, see, he's even getting a call about it. People are calling him now for JavaScript help. So he's used this same script tag to load jQuery into his site. Her browser now does not have to re-download that code. This is already cached on her computer, and that makes Leon's blog load faster. When she comes back to our design, award-winning site, because she's already downloaded this once, it's cached, does not have to be loaded again. The only time she's ever going to have to re-download jQuery now is if we change the version number because a new version of jQuery comes out. So 1.0 came out in 2006. We are now at 3.3.1. So there is a benefit to using the online version of it instead of just having the version that's loaded off of your site. Because if you always have the version loaded off of your site, and let's say you call it something extremely inventive like, I don't know, jQuery.js, the browser is never going to know whether that has been updated to a new version or not. So it will download a cached copy, and let's say you downloaded it when it was 2.8, and we've now updated to 3.3. You're not getting the new code because your browser still thinks it's just jQuery.js. So there's a benefit to doing this. And one thing I forgot to clarify, and let me do that now before we go any further. I said there's these three things that you can pass to the jQuery function. So jQuery is what we call a factory function because its job is to take the parameters that are passed in and return to you an object with the jQuery methods on it. So every time you run the jQuery function, $ here or jQuery, you will get back an object that has all the jQuery methods on it. Every single time, no matter what. If you passed a selector, if you passed a string to make new HTML, that object is going to contain the element or elements that you either selected or created. And you'll have the methods to act on them built into that object. If absolutely nothing was found, you still have a jQuery object with all of those methods on it. So that allows you to keep chaining jQuery methods together because every time you run a jQuery method, you get back a jQuery object. So there's a consistency there that is extremely useful. So now that I've backtracked and covered that, we started off and we looked at how we could select some of these things. So I'm going to load up our page here. And bring up my DevTools. And I'm going to start off just by selecting red. So what I've gotten back, which isn't terribly explicit, is w.f.init. Well, that's an initialized jQuery object, and you can see here that it contains article red.box. So it has run the document.querySelector method. That's what jQuery uses behind the scenes. It's run document.querySelector. It has found my box. And if I look, I go and look at what's in there, I can hover over it and see that that object is selected in there. So I can now start to do some interesting things with it. So let's say var red equals that. So now what's stored in red is a jQuery object. So now if I wanted to, let's say I had a class called rabbits. That's a good noun. I can add class rabbits. That doesn't do anything, but I can now see from what comes back to me that I have an article that's ID of red, class of box, and class of rabbits. So that jQuery method has allowed me to modify the class list. And if I wanted to remove rabbits, I can do that. And I get right back to where I was before. In fact, if I wanted to do something crazy, I can remove the class box. And then that goes away, because the definition for its size and its width and its position was all in class box. But I still have that reference, and so I can add the class box back in. And there we go. So it now becomes very easy with very easily named methods to be able to manipulate this object. And let's say I wanted to change the CSS, red.css. And I'm going to call it background color as a CSS property. green. If I wanted to change multiple things about it, red.css, I could pass an object. Height, let's make it 200 pixels. Width, we'll make it 400 pixels. We'll turn it into a rectangle. So I can change multiple properties at once by passing an object. And there we go. Let's say that I wanted to, what's something interesting I can do here? Actually, we'll pause on messing with this box for right now, because I want to show you the next thing, which is how we do events in jQuery. We got to the point where we wanted to be able to click on the button and turn the box green. So let's do that. And let's bring up our script.js file, which I have helpfully populated with our document ready method. By the way, please type it this way. Don't type out document.ready. Save yourself the grief. There are no cool points that you are ever going to get. In fact, because this is considered best practice, you lose cool points for putting document.ready into your code. It's also a great big red flag for those of us that review your code that you copied and pasted it from Stack Overflow. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge, wink, wink. So, I've got my document ready here, and we had a button called the button. So that's how I can select that button. And I now want to tell my button to listen for clicks. Now, in the jQuery documentation, there is a method called .click, which will add an event listener for clicking. Nice and easy, and then I pass a function here that, does a thing. Pretty straightforward, reads pretty well. And there are helper methods like this for clicking, for hovering, for key up, key down, a bunch of the standard events that, some of the ones we looked at this morning and others. But I'm going to go on record as saying there is a better, more consistent way to do it. .click works, and if you put it in your code, it will work, and any jQuery dev looking at it will go, okay, I know what you've done. But there's a better way. And that is .on. It's a lot more like the syntax of the add event listener in that there's one param that is the event and another param that is the function. So technically it's more params, but here's the cool thing about jQuery's .on. First is, before, if I was doing document.add event listener, I would have to do a new one of those functions for every single event I wanted to listen for. So let's say on an input box I wanted to listen for both key up and key down for different things. Well, I'd have to call document.add event listener. With this, I can say .on, key up, key down, mouse enter, mouse leave, click, whatever I want to put in there, all together as just one call. So I can just list those strings all together in one string and listen to all of those things at once, which is quite nice. Yeah, just put a space between them and list all of the events that I want to listen for, and then I can bind an event handler to all of them. Theoretically, I could put all 380 odd events in there as a single .on and bind one event handler to all the events, which is kind of cool. The other thing that is really cool about .on, and this actually speaks to Clive's question from this morning, is that we talked about the syntax and the use for remove event listener, which is ever so much fun to type. Guess what the opposite of .on is? .off. So .off, and then the list of whatever events I want to turn off listening for, and it's done. Which is kind of nice, yes.
So you don't need to know the name of the function to stop events in jQuery?
You do not need to know the name of the function to stop the events. All you have to do is tell it .off and whatever events you were listening for, and you're done. Yeah.
That's nice.
It is very nice. So, what we did in our dot click before is we found our box and we set the background color to green. That was our first version of that. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to reload our page here. And I'm going to click that button, and it works. Now, I've done that. And when you first look at this, it starts to look like callback hell, because we are now 2 tiers in. Not so bad yet. It could get bad if we were doing other things. The other version of this we did was to test the background color, and if it was green, we turned it back to red. So I'm going to change the way I approach doing this from how I did it this morning, because I want to show off the power of jQuery. And so the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to bring up the style sheet that I wrote, and I'm specifically going to add a rule for .red or #red .green so that I can get past specificity.
Victoria has a question as well.
Oh, there we go. I had seen Carolyn's thing come up, but can you explain that favicon error when you load the page? Yes. Everybody who's using Chrome is going to get that error. Every time you load a page in Chrome, by default, it makes 2 requests. The first is for the actual resource that you requested. The second is for the favicon, which is the little icon that goes up here on the left-hand side of the address bar, and the little icon that goes up here on the left-hand side of the tab. So Chrome tries to fetch that icon for you by default every single time. And if you, in this case, because I don't have a file called favicon.ico, it's 404ing every single time and giving me an ugly red error in my console. The easy way that I could fix this is I could just touch a file called favicon.ico in this directory. And now that file exists. It's not an image, it's just an empty file. And now when I'm requesting this, I don't get that error anymore. That makes it go away. I'm not actually solving the problem, I'm just treating the symptom. It's basically, this is the NyQuil of this particular issue. But Chrome by default makes 2 requests every time you fetch a page to try and get the favicon. If it already has the favicon cached, once it gets it the first time, then it stops requesting it afterwards because it's cached. Same thing we talked about with downloading the jQuery library. So that addresses that. So I've got this class now, .green, that when it is applied to an element with the ID of red, I will turn the background color green. So now that I've added that, I'm going to change this code, and I'm going to say, I'm going to grab the box, so that way I don't have to keep looking it up every time. And I'm going to say if box has class green, box remove class green, else box add class green. A lot easier to read than what we did this morning with checking the string of the background color. I could mean let. I'm using var out of habit more than anything else. Yes, I could totally do let, and that will work. In fact, in this case, I could even use const because I'm not technically rewriting that object, not reassigning it. I will reload that code in, and now I'm able to do that back and forth. But that was a lot of code. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do that. It's a lot easier. If the class is there, it removes it. If it's not there, it adds it. That's what toggle class does. There's a method for that. And the reason there's a method for that is because it's the kind of thing that we would have to write all the time. You know, you've seen things where when you put a checkbox in, it changes the color of a row in some display. Well, ta-da, you now have a way to toggle that class depending on whether or not something has been checked, or depending on whether you clicked on it, or depending on whether you dragged it in the right box. Whatever your business logic is at that point, you now have a way to toggle that class on and off easily without having to write a 5-line if statement. This starts to show off where jQuery gets really powerful. So, the other thing we did is we looked at the Google link here. And we added some behaviors like listening for the click, and we did the alert. We also did the prevent default. So one of the things that's nice about jQuery is it is very consistent. The first parameter that is still passed to my callback is still the event object, because this function is still behind the scenes, behind that Wizard of Oz curtain. Sorry, Sam. Still, this is the function that's getting registered as an event listener. So the event object is still there, which means I can still do event.preventDefault and alert hi. And when I click on Google, I get hi and nothing else. Except Chrome complaining about how long that click handler took to finish. I know, right? My browser feels violated. At least it didn't say like triggered. That would be too culturally relevant. So, the last thing we did was we went the step of saying, okay, there's an empty UL on our page, and we want to change the behavior of our button so that when we click on the button, it adds list items. So I'm going to do the same thing I did before. I'm going to take this function out. And I'm going to define it as button click. And that would work exactly the same as we did before, because this is still just a reference to the function, the definition of the function that's being registered as the event listener. So, just for demonstration's sake, this still works. And the other thing is, you'll notice that I defined it inside my document ready function. Does anyone want to take a guess on why I did that, what the benefit of doing that was? Every function waiting for the DOM to load? Not necessarily, because the thing is, at the point where I would be running button click, red would already exist. So I would be able to get access to it, because there's literally no way for me to run this function before that exists. But I like the way you're thinking. Somebody else want to take a stab? I'll give you a hint. It's a word that starts with S. It's a popular mouthwash. There we go. In stereo, we're available. I am deliberately affecting the scope of this function. This function now only exists inside my document ready callback. So I'm not making global functions, and I may end up having a button click somewhere else on my site. Not a problem, because this is the one that has scope inside this function. So the reason I'm doing this is I'm restricting my scope. I'm not polluting my global namespace with extra functions. and I'm keeping it nice and contained. So let's go the other direction and do what we did this morning. We'll do button click 2. And so what we did with button click 2 was we measured the length of the existing LIs. Well, that was hard. So we measured the list of the existing LIs, and then I created a new LI. I set its inner text to be, there are num plus 1 list items, and then I appended it to my UL. And if you remember doing that this morning, that took a number of lines of code. I've just done all of it in one line by appending jQuery functions to each other. Because each time I run one of these functions, what is returned from that function is a jQuery object that I can then continue to run functions on. And each time it returns, it contains the same matched data. So I start off, I create a new list item element. That's returned to me. I can set the text of that element. That element is now returned to me in a new jQuery object, which is then I can turn around and append that to a selector, in this case, my list. So when I run this, it helps if I change which callback handler I'm using. So when I run this, it did exactly what I told it to do. Does this one still have the list on it? It does. Oh, I'm a fool. That's my fault. I apologize. I actually have to look up the list first. I'm sorry, it's 2 lines of code. Forgive me, I'm a liar. This should now work much better. And it still isn't, which is kind of frustrating. Oh. Wow. Really, I'm new. Yeah. Yeah, sure.
Instead of wrapping that my list in a variable and passing that into append to,
Mm-hmm.
you in the parentheses of append to have the jQuery selector there?
I could, and now that I have the right method, theoretically I should still be able to do this again.
Oh, just like that. Okay.
So I'm just going to double check that real quick. And oh, look, it works.
Okay.
So my initial instinct was right. I just forgot the name of the function.
Right.
My bad. So yeah, we're now able to replicate the behavior from this morning with what we did before. So now just for comparison contrast, this was our code from this morning. And admittedly, I don't have the mouse over happening, but we'll get there in just a sec. But yeah, 40 lines to 17. A little bit different. So that actually brings me to the mouse over kind of behavior. So I said that there were shortcut functions for things like click. There's a really cool one that jQuery gives us for hover. And the hover one, which I will now do, takes 2 functions as parameters. The first one is the callback for the mouse going into the element. The second one is the callback for the mouse going out of the element. So what we're going to do is our first function here for going into blue. We're going to do this. Somebody give me a color. No, sorry, I'm going to go with tomato because it's too good. I got to go with tomato. I could do this with classes and it would work just as fine, but this way I get to talk about the jQuery and this working together. So we've got two functions here. Like I said, first one is when I mouse in, which is the mouse enter event, and the second one is the mouse leave event. And I've registered both of them using .hover. So when I do that, that's the behavior I get. And if that's the color of your tomatoes, you need to be buying better tomatoes. But now there's two event listeners attached to that particular object. And the reason that worked is because of how event handlers work with jQuery's or JavaScript's this keyword. So here's an interesting thing to know to file away into the ever-growing vault of truths about JavaScript that you have in your head. It is that when you trigger an event in client-side JavaScript, the event handler inside that function, this is going to refer to the element itself. So if I click on a button, this inside that event handler refers to the button itself. Technically, we know from week 1 that this as a keyword refers to the object that invoked the function. That is the blanket definition of this in every context. It refers to the object that invoked that function. This only has context inside of a function. So when we do this type of event handling, since the first function and the second function are bound to mouse enter and mouse leave respectively, they are bound to those event listeners on that element of the page. When the mouse enters that element, technically that element is running its own event handler. When I click on the button, technically the button is running its own event handler, which is why we can use this to refer to the element itself. So you'll find this pattern. I love talking about this. You'll find this pattern used quite frequently in JavaScript so that you do something, like I click on a button and then I can change something about that button, or I can now bind a click action to any element on a page and change its behavior by referring to it with this wrapped in the jQuery object. So this was why I said that when we were talking about selectors earlier, passing a string that's a selector to jQuery, that you could also pass a variable that points to an element. Because in this case, this keyword points to that element. That's the context it has set for it. And so what I get back is a jQuery object with this that contains the blue box, because that's what was hovered over in and out. Up here, for example, just to give a different demonstration, when I click on the link, it won't do anything, but its text will change to fooled ya. It looked like a link. You know, walks like a duck, quacks like a duck. Wasn't actually a duck. And I'm able to do that so easily, instead of having to go and look up that link again by an ID, by a class, by some selector, because the link technically is the one that ran its own event handler. So I can refer to it with this and immediately change properties on it. I could change anything about that element I wanted. because jQuery gives me full access to every single DOM property and attribute, and in fact gives me nice simple helper functions for most of them. Question? Oh, yay jQuery, yeah, seriously. Now, this library is primarily a DOM traversal library. There's a second major piece to it, which we will get into tomorrow, which is the infamous acronym AJAX. And so that is using jQuery to make requests to an API, to a database, whatever, to fetch data from somewhere and bring it back and work it into your page without having to reload the whole page. If you think about Gmail and how Gmail does not have to refresh the page to tell you that you've got new mail, that's the kind of behavior that we're talking about. So that's the other major piece to jQuery, but jQuery started off just as a library for doing DOM manipulation and traversal, to make it easier to find elements on a page and then be able to manipulate their properties. Yeah.
What about using arrow functions in jQuery?
You can totally.
The function, I know it's not all browsers are fully compatible, but
Yeah.
let's say you didn't care.
Yeah. You could totally use arrow functions with jQuery. I will freely admit that the reason I still use var and still use manual function keywords here is because I am old. And I just have a muscle memory that won't go away. This is my equivalent of hashtag get off of my lawn. Yeah. So it's purely muscle memory. I could take every single one of these functions, convert it to a fat arrow function, and it would work flawlessly. And if you like that syntax and you're comfortable with that syntax and you don't care about mobile browsers, you're fine. And even then, we saw this morning on Can I Use that there's only like one that it's not going to work on and nobody cares about it anyway. So you're fine. Yeah, I have muscle memory that's really hard to rewrite, which is funny because if I was to swap over and start doing Express, I would immediately start using constant let and fat arrow functions everywhere. Because my brain is thinking in jQuery, it automatically thinks this way. I'm stuck in ES5 for front end. If I code in React, which you guys will get to in a couple weeks, immediately it's all ES6. I don't know why. But yeah, anytime I'm doing jQuery, I'm just stuck in ES5. So it's purely muscle memory. Yeah, use fat arrow functions. They work great. Use constant let. They work great. And they're totally useful. Now, the same way this morning that I took these functions and I broke them out, like what I've done here with button click and button click 2, in fact, it's encouraged to do that with all of your callback functions because it makes for cleaner code. And I can take these ones the same way. Too far. And we'll call this one hover in. And we'll call that one hover out. And suddenly the lines 24 to 28, which are the actual bits of code that are running when document ready fires, now they're a lot easier to read. And also nicely, this still does what we would want, this still does what we would want, this still does what we would want. So it cleans up your code to move those out. These lines of code down here are now much easier to troubleshoot because you don't have those inline functions. Inline functions are the great way to do the first draft of something. Write inline functions to get your first draft done. Working code is worth more than pretty code every single day of the week. Working code can ship and generate revenue. Pretty code is code that you're willing to put your name on as saying, hey, this is my best work. So use the inline functions, the anonymous functions, as the first draft of what you're building and get to the point that you've solved the logical problems. Make sure you've tested the query selectors and everything is going the way you want it to go. And then once you're happy with that, then refactor it. Because that process of refactoring after you've solved the logic means that you're more likely to come out with working code than if you try and optimize it ahead of time. In fact, there's a quote about programming you will find online, which is premature optimization is the root of all evil. And it is. If you're too worried about how the code looks before you write it, you will never write good code. In fact, you'll be lucky to write code at all because you'll feel like you're handcuffed. That's the coder's equivalent of writer's block. So use inline functions to get started. Get it to work, then go back and make it better and really give it the spit and polish kind of treatment that turns it into something prettier and more maintainable. Because the context of things like this and event and stuff like that, they haven't changed just because I moved the functions out. When that function gets called, it's still getting called exactly the same way, so the context means the exact same thing. So it still works. Thanks, Josh. So, any questions about how I got to here from what we had this morning? I mean, now I've made this terribly long at 29 lines. The other one was 40. And I've replicated pretty much all the behaviors we did, except for that annoying alert, which I'd promised myself I was not going to do this afternoon. Got a couple coming in from Victoria. Since we're new to client.js and DOM manipulation, should we continue with vanilla JS until we are comfortable and then use jQuery later? I'm going to go ahead and say no. I'm going to go ahead and say do your best to adopt jQuery sooner rather than later. This is more likely to be how you are going to be interacting with the apps that you're going to support out in the real world. The number we showed earlier, 22.4% of the websites in the world use jQuery. That means there's a 1 in 5 chance that when you go out and get a job with a dev firm, their legacy app that they have working that is out there generating revenue, attracting customers, being used by people, there's a 1 in 5 chance that it's going to have jQuery in it. So you want to know this now. Also, because this simplifies the process for you so much. This is so much easier to use. The syntax is cleaner. Go ahead and make this jump now. Because what we've done with this morning and now follows the educational principle that we use a lot, where we do peel back that curtain and we show you the gears and the levers underneath and show you what's going on. And then we say, here's the nice helpful way to do this that's the best practices that you now understand the inner workings of because you've actually sat down and written some of that code. This is by far going to be your best practice to use. So I would say go ahead and make the jump to jQuery. Maybe don't lose those vanilla JavaScript skills. Know when they are valid. But I would go ahead and make the jump. Will you put the inline functions in the notes as well? I can do that, totally. Yeah, I'll make that edit before I send these out. Any other questions? Okay, last thing I will mention. When it comes to jQuery, there is an extremely rich plugin ecosystem. So instead of having to rewrite everything from scratch, let's say you want a drop-down menu, or let's say you want an image carousel, or let's say you want to click on something and have it pop up a YouTube video, or any of those types of standard behaviors that you see anywhere on the web. There are, no joke, hundreds of thousands of jQuery plugins out there that will do almost everything you can imagine. So before you decide that you're going to reinvent the wheel, I'm sure it will be nice and round and work very well, go see if there's plugins out there. You just literally Google jQuery plugins for whatever it is you want to do. There are hundreds of thousands of them out there, and it is as easy as adding a script tag and then you now have access to that plugin. jQuery always goes first, plugins come after that, and then ta-da, you have a brand new method on jQuery that you can use for whatever you might want. Dot carousel, dot image gallery, dot whatever it is that you've installed the plugin to do. Some of them will work better than others. Some of them you will find come close to what you want. Sometimes that's good enough. When you are using a plugin, you are accepting someone else's compromises, but you're also typically bringing in code that someone else has already fought the battles to get to work. So there are a bunch of really, really good ones out there. It's just a matter of you finding one that will help you do what it is you want to do. But be aware there's an extremely rich ecosystem. There's still tens of thousands of them being written every year because of the fact of how prevalent this library is. So, the plugin ecosystem, just read the directions. Every single one of them will tell you how to use it, how to bring it into your app, how to install it, how to everything. Just read the instructions. Because every developer, has done it possibly slightly different. So as long as you read the instructions almost like you would for an NPM module. The same way that we would refer back to npm.js for something like cookie parser versus cookie session, or how to use request and which order the parameters go in, just check out the documentation for your jQuery plugins, and it will tell you exactly how to use them. But there's one out there that does pretty much everything. So, cool. I'll get this code packaged up and sent out to you guys. Thank you.